Rachel's a block away.
So. All right. Yeah, we're going to try, if it works, a few things this evening with our fun technology. Oh, it's going to work. And there's a few things that we talked about last week that I wanted to repeat in chapter 5, and that was the breakdown of the different kings and how that transition worked, because I think that's pretty significant to see how all that played out. And then when we talk about the actual writing on the wall that we saw there, let me get rid of something here. So the other part is the writing on the wall, and there's debate about if it was Hebrew or if it was some sort of other cuneiform or some sort of other writing from that time or another language of some sort, or maybe something even divine letters. A lot of people followed that it was some sort of Hebrew text, maybe an older version of Hebrew text without any of the markings, which could have led to some confusion too, and we'll talk about that more. But I was going to show you guys some examples of what that looked like and some interpretations of that as well. But before we get going, let's pray. And yes, ma'am. Would you like to join us? Or are you looking for
what group is this?
This is the Daniel. We study the book of Daniel right now.
What is there an age group?
Oh, no. Anyone. Whatever age or...
No, you have to be at least 70. No, I'm sorry.
You can...
Come on in.
Come on. Yeah, come on in.
We don't mind.
Okay. All right. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, again, thank you for tonight, and thank you for everyone who's here, and thank you for this book of Daniel that we can study and use to be able to navigate our world today and to be able to better understand about who we are and who you are in us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. We did start into chapter 5 last week. We talked a little bit about Belshazzar and a little bit about what was going on behind the scenes that isn't really spoken about in the biblical text here, but if you go back and you look at the historical text, you see a lot of good information about the Persians are there pretty much on the doorsteps of the Babylonians at this point. Belshazzar, there's a little debate about Belshazzar, who is referred to as in here he's referred to as a king, but actually he's what we refer to as a co-regent, along with his father, Nabonidus. That was one of his names. But Nabonidus liked to travel a lot. And so what he did is that he turned his son, Belshazzar, into a co-regent, so his co-regent son could kind of rule the kingdom while Nabonidus, was out and about traveling the world. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of go do a quick breakdown of the kings and how we got to this point after Nebuchadnezzar. And you guys may know some of this, and if you can't see it in the back, I'm going to read through it anyways. So we know that Nebuchadnezzar died about 562 BC. He ruled from 605 to 562. And then his son, and his name was Evil Merodach, and that would be a fun name to have. But anyways, and he was not a very pleasant person, as you can imagine by his name. He only reigned for 2 years. And then Neriglissar, and depending on your translation, and depending on what historical text you're looking at, his name changes pretty dramatically, but we're going to go with Neriglissar. He kills Merodach, who is his brother-in-law, and rules for 4 years. And then the son of Neriglissar, Labashi Marduk. Is that familiar to anyone, that name, Marduk? What is that? It's one of the Babylonian, it's the main Babylonian god. So a lot of these guys had names that were tied somehow to the Babylonian gods. He only reigned for 2 months and then was assassinated. And then Nabonidus, who is the current king, along with Belshazzar, the co-regent, so they're kind of co-regents, he's the real king. He's not really brought up at all in this, at all, but he was the king during this time. And then Belshazzar, and I put in quotes, ruled, because he wasn't really truly the king, but he was the one who kind of was in charge when this was all going down. So I wanted you guys to see that, get an overview of once Nebuchadnezzar left. So in between chapter 4 and chapter 5, there's no these four kings ruled, and then now we have Belshazzar. It was Nebuchadnezzar, and now we have Belshazzar. And so I just wanted to show you a bunch of stuff that happened between 562 and where we are right now with Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. Grandson. No, sorry, he was a son. He's a grandson, because we'll get a little bit into that. Because Belshazzar here will be referred to as your father. So if you look there in verse 2, Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. I believe I mentioned this briefly last week, but father here just means they were related, and they can track it back to, or descendants, probably a better word, and they can track it back to Nebuchadnezzar as his grandfather and not his father at this point.
Babylonius and evil Murdoch are rulers.
Yes. Yeah. No, Evil was the son of Nebuchadnezzar.
All right.
Yeah. And then Belshazzar's mom, I'm going to say her name like a narcotic, Necrocus, was his wife, Neriglassar's wife.
Okay.
So I know that makes it all extremely clear right now, but that's how that was. I should have put her in there kind of as part of the path, but I kind of ran out of time on that. But yeah, there's a lot of people in play here, and she is most likely the queen mother that shows up later on in this chapter. Yeah.
I think there's one other thing that gives you, if you
Sure.
really want to take a guess at Daniel's age. I mean, there's 65 years from 605 to 540. So he was at 65 years, plus if he was 15 when he came across.
Yeah, he's in his 80s.
He must have been in his 80s year
I think
old.
some said he was 83. About
83.
83 or
Yeah.
something at this point. Yeah.
That's good historical fact. You can add those together and
Yeah.
come up with his age.
It's amazing, and that he survived that long with all this craziness going on.
Yeah.
Especially with, you'd hate to work with a guy named Evil, or any of these guys for that matter. But yeah, it's interesting to see how he played out throughout the entire thing as a historical figure, and how these kings were part of it. And the really neat part about this is that it's all backed up by literature outside the Bible. So you have the biblical historical event that's happening here, but also you have Babylonian history as well as Persian history that backs all this up too. So it's pretty cool to see how that plays out. All right. Let's see here. Okay, let's read a little bit and move on from here. If we do repeat a little bit tonight, my apologies, but I just wanted us to kind of cover a few things. Before we get too far along, if you want to go ahead and look at, say, Genesis 40, verses 20 through 22, or at least put a finger there, because we're going to go talk about that here in a second, because it's going to relate to banquets during this time period. Banquets sometimes were known to be something that would be very positive, but also bode ill many times whenever you see a banquet historically here. I believe last we talked a little about there's different variations and different takes. Just like if you were looking at the Battle of the Bulge from World War II, or my father fought in Vietnam, and he was at a battle referred to as Hamburger Hill, and they just came out with a book on that, and there's a variation that the book came out with, and then there's my dad's variation of who fought there. And it's one of those things where you kind of see the same sort of thing with this issue coming on with the Persians attacking the Babylonians. You have a Persian viewpoint here, and you also have a Babylonian viewpoint here, and you also have, of course, the Jewish viewpoint here. And what we're seeing mainly is the Jewish viewpoint of how it happened. And the main focus here, of course, is what Belshazzar is doing there in verse 2, whenever he is using the gold and silver vessels from the temple. We get that as the Jewish standpoint. From the Persians, we know that there is a governor by the name of Ugbaru, 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 who ended up eventually, we understand, to be leading the show we'll talk about that here in a little bit when we start looking at Darius at the end of this chapter. The Persians were coming in, and there could have either been Cyrus could have been leading the charge, or this guy Ugbaru could have been leading the charge. Either way, someone was coming in and was attacking the Babylonians at this point. There's a few different takes about what Belshazzar was doing and why he was celebrating so much at this point. One viewpoint was Belshazzar had just come back from a battle, and that he was celebrating, or at least relieving the stress of that battle, and knowing, and so brought in all of his closest, was 1,000 of his closest noble friends. That's one take about why this festival is going on, or this feast is going on. Another take is that they know they're about to be attacked, they're about to be destroyed, and this is Belshazzar's way of, if I look at it, it's a type of arrogance that he's showing, that he still thinks he's this all-powerful leader and nothing's going to happen to him, and that he is going to be okay, and if he just drinks enough, everything will be just fine. And those are just very short summaries of different versions of what was going on. But we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Any thoughts? If you look at the first 4 verses here of chapter 5, we read through this last week. We know that what he's doing here is he's pretty much mocking God, mocking the Jewish God by bringing out these gold and silver vessels. Some would even say he's mocking his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar, depending on who you ask, almost became a believer in God. Calvin, like I said last week, didn't think he quite made it. Others believe he did. So it could be that as well. It could just be a sign of a mocking of just religion in general, mocking the Jewish religion. And you also got to think this is from a Jewish standpoint, so they probably take this a little bit more further than what he could have been doing, but just think of it that way as well. The issue for the author of who's writing Daniel is that they were worshiping idols, using their living God's vessels to do it, and that, of course, was a form of idolatry and blasphemy that they could not stand for, and of course, as you can imagine, would make them very upset. Any other thoughts or observations that you see in those 4 verses?
Reminds me of the king with Bathsheba when he started drinking.
Okay.
And he tried to show off his wife. And just like that mockery.
Okay, yeah.
Like, yeah. He just got drunk.
Yeah.
It just started, and it really like snowballed from there.
Yeah, just kind of got out of hand.
Disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
And it just always, I don't know. And then there were consequences for it.
Right. Don't we see the same thing in the book of Esther? Whenever before Esther becomes queen, what happened? Why did she become queen in the first place? The king is arrogant. He tries to show his wife off. She doesn't want to. She leaves the scene, or she's kicked out. And then Esther is believed to be the most beautiful woman, is brought in as his new queen. So there's other signs of arrogance throughout the Bible, as we know. Any other observations here?
Just a timeline.
Yes, sir.
The first conquering of Jerusalem was in chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
This is the second, because they didn't raid the temple when they first took over. All they did was take a few of the people.
Right.
And then the second time, when one of these guys up there, not one of them, one of the Israelis, I forget his name, he rebelled against him again, and then they had the second invasion of Jerusalem, which then is when they took all the gold and silver and all the utensils out of the temple. So this period of time would be the second conquering of Jerusalem, or raping of Jerusalem.
It'd be after that, yes. But it'd be after all that happened, and Nebuchadnezzar's passed on. Yes, it'd be after that time period. Yep. All right, let's look at verses 5. We'll read these this time. 5 through 9. if someone would like to read 5 through 9, this is when we get the theophany of God, similar to, well, we'll talk about what this all means, but we've had other theophanies from God throughout. Anyone would like to read those?
At that moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale, and his thoughts so terrified him that he soiled himself and his knees knocked together. The king shouted to bring in mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. He said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this inscription and gives me its interpretation will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain around his neck and have the third highest position in the kingdom." So all the king's wise men came in, but none could read the inscription or make its interpretation known to him. Then King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale, and his nobles were bewildered.
What translation is that?
CSB.
Yeah, that one about what he does there, that's true. That's probably the truest version I've heard in a while. Yeah, for the most part, that's what he did. And that's what it says. Some of you may have his hip joints went slack. It's pretty much he had a pretty, It was what
NIV really
Dwight
waters
said.
it down. There's no mention of
What does NIV say?
defecation.
It just said his legs became weak and his knees were knocking.
Yeah, that's not what happened. I mean, well,
So you
it
do
probably
what
happened,
you
but
according to
the author's intent was it was extremely, extremely scared, and bad things happened at that point.
There's
So-
no mention of him changing his clothes.
So he probably died that night, and so there probably
No,
was
I
never
mean-
that chance. Yeah, he doesn't change.
Yeah, funny.
No, I'm sorry. I get it. I'm sorry. So this finger that we see here, that of course, as you can imagine, would freak anyone out, is the same one that we see in Exodus 31 when God, of course, writes the tablets for Moses to bring down to the people. So we know it is the hand of God. There's a lot of evidence that it is the hand of God. It's not an angelic hand. It's not somebody else's hand. They really truly believe that it was the same sort of thing. So if you were to turn to 31:18 in Exodus, I'll read it while I'm here. When he had finished speaking with him upon Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. So it's pretty clear just based on how this is written and what we see in Exodus, as well as some other historical texts that we have, that it was the hand of God. So which is why I'm referring to it as a theophany, much like another theophany, of course, would be the burning bush that Moses saw as well. So that you have all of that being worked out as you see through this. So as you can see, when that happened, the man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. It was very typical. The plaster reference here is very typical for wealthy homes during that time to have plaster on their walls. Other homes of the lower class did not. So he just kind of brings up a point about how nice this facility was, or this building was. That plaster is referenced here. The king saw it, the back of the hand that did the writing. Some would argue that it was only him who saw this vision, but then you have most others would say actually probably everybody in the room saw it. That no one understood what it was. He probably was not the only one who reacted this way. We're really only getting the king's perspective here. But some people would say just because the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing means that only he saw it, but there's too many other people who would disagree with that, and that the whole room saw it. And so we can move on from that one. So we know that the vision, this manifestation of terror that happens. Some people say he was possibly hallucinating based on his level of drunkenness. That is, I found that to be a weak argument with other people I looked at and other commentaries I read. He is not hallucinating. He's not too drunk. It's not one of those things. He is truly seeing what this is happening here. So what does he do? In verse 7, he does what his grandfather did whenever he had his dreams. He calls up the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. And he spoke to these wise men. and he gave them a similar sort of thing that his grandfather did. But he does things that the Pharaoh has done in the past. So if you go back to Joseph with the Pharaoh back in Genesis 41, other points of references in the Old Testament is there's typically 3 things that kings like to give away if someone does something of great value or favor to them. And what we see here is you always have the purple clothing, which is, of course is a sign of nobility and wealth. You see a gold necklace is offered out, which of course is wealth and prestige. And then here, kind of like with Joseph, but also with Daniel and some other points along the way, some sort of level of higher power or ability, and at this point you become the 3rd person in charge of the kingdom. And so after I've explained Belshazzar and these 2 guys working together, so this is number 1, this is number 2, whoever figures it out is number 3, ruler-wise of the kingdom, is what we see here of what he's offering here in verse 7 of this. So and then as you go into 8, again, they come in, and the wise men could not read what is being said. And this is where there's a lot of things you can think about this. Of course, they were not given the wisdom or the ability that we know that Daniel eventually will be given to be able to read this. That could be one of it. Some have looked at this and said, well, it was a foreign language, a writing they were not familiar with. And this is where I wanted to show you guys some of the options here. So this is Rembrandt's version of what is going on here. And he looks a whole lot better off than what the Bible describes him to be. He looks like he's still pretty much got together, but we know that's not true. What we find here, this is depicted as Hebrew in that regard. It's not the words. So if you look at what's up here, it's not the same as what this is. And so this is the true Hebrew that was written. And it reads as you guys know, Hebrew goes from right to left, right? So that's going. I translated it, well, of course, it's translated in your Bible from, as we're typically used to doing it, left to right, mene, tekel, upashur. And then if we take it from the Hebrew and put it in our English, this is what it would look like. So as you can see, this is really means nothing in our viewpoint. And the reason that is, and the reason this is causing confusion for the people, is because there's no vowels, right? There are no markings. There are no markings to tell them what these words can mean, because in Hebrew, one word, such as this would be tickle right here, a tikel, that's a T, a Q, and an L, which is what you see right here. I'm using that very loosely. What you see here could be, depending on what suffix or prefix you add, or even a single marking, could change that word dramatically. And so that's why it's so hard sometimes to translate Hebrew, because there could be so many variations of this, say, root word of what it could be, that it probably could have really thrown these guys off, and you really needed the wisdom of God to be able to figure out what was being written there. So I translated it, and so this is much easier to read, right? So I added the markings for the vowels, and so when Jesus says every dot and tittle counts, it literally does mean every dot and tittle counts. So the mene here, these are your E's, these 3 dots. They have official names, I'm just going to call them 3 dots. So this is your M, your N. These 2 things, characters, are actually silent. They mean nothing. Well, they don't mean nothing, but they're silent. So M, E, N, E, M, E, N, E. And then you have your tekel, which is your T, E, but it's a long E, so it's an A, it's a tekel, so you have an E, which is also this marking here and this marking here. Your Q, which is actually a P, and then you have an L with another E, E at the end. So tekel, mene, tekel, and then you have your last one here, and you only have one vowel, and that's an A. So everyone knows, of course, a little dash underneath under that is an A, right? And am I right?
How'd you fit that on a 3x5 card for studying?
Oh, yeah, I know, right? It's fun. So, okay. VPRS, that's a Y. So this Y looks a whole lot like, where'd it go? This E, right? That's why it's so much fun to interpret this. So it's very, you have to be very precise. I did this quickly, and so it's not great, but I don't have good handwriting anyways. But anyways, here it is. So this is what it would have read as. And so if they would have had these markings and some of this additional context here, they probably could have better figured out what it meant. They didn't. And plus, I also think that my viewpoint is you really needed Daniel or someone who had the wisdom of God to really be able to truly understand it. But that is one way we could interpret what they were trying to write there. So that's a fun. I encourage anyone to take Hebrew if you want to blow your mind up. It's good stuff. All right.
But the fact that people can see this on the wall says it wasn't just those are having an hallucination.
Right. Yes. Everyone in there could see it, and so, but no one else could figure it out. And whenever you actually read about what he was trying to say there, it needed to be deciphered. Even if they could have figured out what those words meant, I think they still needed to decipher what God was trying to say to him at that point. So as we continue on here, they came in, they were stumped. And Dwight, can you read verse 9 again from yours?
Then King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale, and his nobles were bewildered.
Okay. All right. Okay. I just was trying to remember what that last one was. So no one can figure this out. We kind of went over this. I said earlier that it could have been some sort of other language that was being used, but tonight we're going to go with that. It was a form of Hebrew, maybe an older form, ancient form, or maybe something that they just weren't able to decipher. All right, let's move on to verse 10 through 12. Anyone want to read that?
The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means.
Thank you. So we have the queen here is understood to be Belshazzar's mother. She was apparently a very prominent political figure. She had a lot of power in the kingdom, especially as Nabonidus was out traveling. She seemed to have a lot of say. What's one thing that we notice that this king does, that Nebuchadnezzar does, and some of these other kings have done throughout the time? What is his response? If you looked at his response contrasted to, say, her response.
May the king live forever.
You talking about what was different between Belshazzar and the queen mother?
Yeah, their responses.
Yeah, so Belshazzar calls for his advisors.
Right.
The queen mother calls for something to God.
Yeah, so the kings continue to repeat their mistakes, right? Versus the mom who's come in, or the queen mother who's come in and is like, well, how about this? There's some actual wisdom we can use here. And we see that time and time again where you have these seemingly powerful kings who are extremely arrogant, who really don't think very well. And then you have someone like the queen steps in and says, hey, how about we try this? And this is something that you see happening time and time again. And I turn to 2 Kings 11, 1 through 3, and it's another good example of that. And it's about Athaliah, the queen of Judah. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she rose and destroyed all the royal offspring. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Hazaziah, took Joash, the king of Hazaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons who were being put to death, and placed him on his nurse in the bedroom. So they hid him from Athaliah, and he was not put to death. So he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord 6 years while Athaliah was reigning over the land. That is just an example, and it maybe seem a little off, but it's just another example of a wise queen helping out in other times of insanity. So she helps out here. She helps provides a little bit of perspective for the king and for him to be able to make some wise decisions here. And she kind of gives an overview of who Daniel is. And she gives us a little bit of history, some history that most likely Belshazzar either was not aware of, he probably was, but most likely had forgotten in his current state that there was someone out there that had already helped his grandfather along the way. There's 4 things that she lists about Daniel. What are they? What are the 4 things that you see there in verses 11 and 12?
He has a keen mind, he has knowledge, he has understanding, he has the ability to interpret dreams. He can, it's more than 4, explain riddles and solve problems.
What are those summarized as, though? What is that telling us about him? I know those. What would you take that as? Is what this idea of where does he get his insight from? What is she pointing to?
God.
Right, and everything he has.
And she refers to him as Daniel.
Yes.
And she acknowledges that the
Mhm.
king gave him a non-Hebrew name, but then she continues to refer to him as Daniel.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is different than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because we kind of acknowledge that, like,
They were never renamed again.
they were, those other names stuck.
Yeah. So we see the Spirit of God working through Daniel through this, and she knows it. She has seen it, or obviously has witnessed it at some point. Has obviously made a mark on her to where she can remember this. And it can help with these mysteries. We don't really get the word mystery through this, but we remember from last couple of weeks we've been talking about mysteries, and those are the insights and revelations that God can provide. So we see all of that here. And then as we go into verse 13 through 17, Daniel's brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" It's an odd question. His mother just said who it was. "Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you." So, okay, it's not the spirit of a god or the God or of the holy God, or as his grandfather said, the Most High God. It's of the spirit of the gods. So he's far from where he needs to be. He's not even henotheistic. He is completely polytheistic. And that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom has been found in you. So he understands that there's some sort of power that is coming into Daniel, but he doesn't recognize it as being Daniel's God who's providing that power at this point. "Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have the authority as the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Now what's really funny about all this, and we're going to get a little bit of this from Daniel's response in the next couple verses, is that if the Persians are about to knock down his door and they're about to be taken over by the Babylonians, we know this guy's not clueless enough to think that the Persians aren't about to attack at some level, right? Or about to really cause a whole lot of problems in Babylon, if not completely take over Babylon. Yet he's still offering to be the 3rd ruler of the kingdom. He's still offering all of these things that he most likely will not be able to deliver on, and as we know, does not. But it's just interesting that he continues to do that. You know, one other observation that I find to be interesting, and this may just be way too me thinking too much about it, is that how do you think that? You said the writing was on the wall. Do you think it was burned in? I mean, do you think it's like? I mean, how does it work? Because it's still there. It's not like it's. I don't think it's floating, or it's there, right? It's there. Does it ever go away? I wonder if you guys ever think about it that way. I mean, it's not as beautiful as this, I know, but what do you ever thought about that? Because the inscription is still there. Do you think it matters?
Well, plaster is.
Do you think he melted the plaster? I mean, what do you think?
It is rather fragile.
Yeah.
I mean, with any force at all, you're going to make an indentation. I'm not saying that's what happened, but.
Well, yeah, it's hard to.
Yeah, my 5-year-old can
Tell us.
destroy plaster. Let me tell you.
Okay.
My 30-year-old too.
My 14-year-old.
Yeah. Imagine what the hand of God could do.
Yeah. Okay.
Inscribe on stone like he inscribe on plaster.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What do you think about what?
Question about,
Yeah.
so he was promised, Daniel was, wasn't he already given second authority by Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah, he was already really powerful.
So,
Yeah.
so he's promising him something lesser than
got
what he currently
demoted.
has, or? Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Retired.
well,
Well, with the change of leadership,
Yeah.
wouldn't his
he's still got second.
responsibilities changed?
I would technically
Likely.
say, yeah, I think so. But technically, he's still kind of second in charge because those kings they're co-regents, and so, I mean, but yeah, I agree. Also, as new leadership comes in, he could probably have to work his way back up, or
Term limits.
there's term limits.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Where is it here? Because Darius has to do it. Yeah, when we go to chapter 6, we'll see what Darius does, if his name really is Darius. But we'll see what that looks like here, because there's 3 commissioners that were brought in. But yeah, it's I couldn't imagine. So he's like I said, probably 80, 83 years old, and he's dealing with this Yahoo they're about to get attacked. Daniel doesn't know if he's going to survive the night or either, and it's just very interesting to kind of really think about what's going on in this banquet hall during this time. Let's continue on. Unless there's any additional thoughts from 13 to 16. All right. As we move on here, one thing we're going to see Daniel start doing here is he's going to start looking more like a prophet and less as a sage or a dream interpreter. I mean, there's, of course, prophets do that to a point, but he's going to kind of come more prophetic in how he's going to come from here, and especially as we go into the rest of Daniel. So there's kind of a turning point for him. And notice also how Daniel responds in verse 17. He does not say what the queen says or what the other the Chaldeans or the other folks say. He pretty much abruptly just says, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I'll read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. He does not say, O king, live forever before he starts, or anything related to that. It is a very abrupt response that he gives to the king or to the co-regent as he begins. Who'd like to read? It's a decent amount, from 18 to 24.
I have it in the NIV here. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar, your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and sets his throne above anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription.
Thank you. So what does Daniel do at this point? He doesn't just jump into the interpretation, does he?
It's true.
Yeah.
He didn't say the interpretation yet.
Yeah. So what's going on? What's he trying to? What point? Well, part of it. What point is the author trying to make? What point is Daniel making?
Compares him to a more powerful king, and then he still fell. Like God, he says God gave him this ability,
Yes.
and he did all of these things, very powerful, but still.
So God gave Nebuchadnezzar the
Yes,
ability,
yes.
and now Belshazzar has given an ability, all provided by God.
Yes, but when
And
his
what
heart,
has he done with it?
yeah, well,
Right.
his heart was arrogant, pride, and all that,
Right.
like a donkey in the field.
So yeah, he was driven away, as we talked about last week, and was probably, some would say, a werewolf or some sort of other animal malady. So the entire time, I guess, if you look through this, is that Nebuchadnezzar was given. He's pretty much given everything. He was given the power. He was given the authority. All of it was given to him from God. Ends up being just it's almost like a shell of God's power. And then there's also through this, as we see through these verses, is that there's a contrast between words that are used to describe God, especially if you look in verse 18. Most High God, that's a reference towards typically God, the Jewish God. A sovereign God, or the God of sovereignty, is of course a reference to the Judean God. Glory and majesty, all of those are words that were used to describe God and now are being contrasted against Nebuchadnezzar. And so we see the true power of God being contrasted with this power that has been provided to this earthly king. At the end of the day, whether they like it or not, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, all the other kings we had listed up here earlier, the future kings, Darius and Cyrus, all those guys, they are just, puppet's not the right word, but they're servants. They're servants of God, here to do God's work here on earth. And Daniel's starting to provide that, but also at the same time provide a little historical context about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar because of his arrogance and the way he lived and how he had to eat grass like the wild donkeys and the cattle and live like that.
But why doesn't this king know that, like, why does the queen have to tell him about Daniel? Why doesn't he know about Daniel? Why doesn't he know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Things like this would be legendary, why doesn't...
I bet he does know. He's just arrogant. He doesn't want to admit to it, or he doesn't care. I imagine somebody at some point told him a story, and she's trying to, going back to verse 10, she's trying to remind him about Nebuchadnezzar and what Daniel did and everything related to that. And now Daniel's trying to remind him as well. And I think mainly he's probably pretty arrogant and just doesn't either want to or...
I think he's like a
What do you
young
think?
whippersnapper.
Okay.
He's when you use the word arrogant, I mean, it's almost as if he's apathetic towards what happened in the past. Here I am now, and Daniel comes in and he dresses him down.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he puts him in his place. Essentially, tells him you're just a Johnny-come-lately. Here's
Right.
what's happened in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, you think you're powerful, but actually you're not, and God is the actual powerful one, and God is using you to further His kingdom. I mean, I think that's part of that as well.
I think it's pretty common lots of folks who've grown up or seen who God is and know who God truly is in the United States, but then success comes, maybe a job or the easy life, and you just forget about God's authority and that everything good is from God.
Okay, yeah. No, I can see that too. We forget sometimes who God is and how He allowed us to do or provide us opportunities, and we think we did it ourselves, and He was there behind us. I mean, is that?
I think so,
Too-
and
too
yet,
part of it, yeah.
of course, this family is not. The Nebuchadnezzar's family is not a God-fearing family. They've been exposed to God's miracles and Daniel within the country, but it's never taken root to see that the God of all gods is really who He is.
Right. Yeah, it almost took root with Nebuchadnezzar, and it seems like since then it's kind of, well, maybe the queen has remembered some of it, but for the most part it's not taken root. I agree. I could see that. One thing we can also look here with Belshazzar, as you look at, say, the last few verses here, the 22 through 24, we just get the example of that Nebuchadnezzar was actually given another opportunity, but it doesn't seem Belshazzar is giving another opportunity. He's not given the same opportunity to I don't know if repent or to change his arrogance or to turn to God. It seems like he is just willfully blind, brazen against God as you look through here, especially as you go into 23 and what he was doing with these vessels of the house of God and how he invited his wives and his concubines in. Some would say that he could have used those vessels to go back to remember his grandfather and his grandfather's almost faith, but instead it's like this idea that he disdains God. He's totally against God and is doing this grotesque, idolatrous way of worshiping these dead idols. As you can see there in silver, and these gods of silver and gold and of bronze and iron. Of course, we've seen all these metals before, earlier on, so that symbolism is back. But the key part here is they do not see, hear, understand, contrasting with the God who does see, hear, and understand, and who's given him the life that he is, for the most part, has turned away from God in that regard. So you know, some would say that Belshazzar would and should know better, but he doesn't, and it's probably because of his arrogance here. And eventually, by the end of the night, the Medes will take over, and his power and he for the most part dies that evening. But he lost any opportunity to come to know who the true and ultimate God is. And so now we get into the reading of the.
Got a food for thought.
Yes, sir.
You think he was anti-Semitic? That was his reasoning. He would not call him a Jew.
I don't
because
know.
a lot of persecution was taking place among
It could have been, yeah. I mean, it could have been. He got to that
Chronicles
point.
on that.
Yeah.
There was a lot of persecution going
Yeah.
on in Babylon.
Yeah.
And
There was, and just because, I mean, you can see that. We'll see that with the anti-Semitic viewpoints in the next chapter as we go with the Persians. So yeah, it could have been. He just didn't want to hear from this Jewish guy because I don't like Jews. So
Well,
that's what
we
he
saw
said.
tell him.
We saw it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also.
Right. Yeah, I think there's
They were
an underlying
detested
current.
by
Right.
by the Babylonian other rulers.
Right. But they always seem to come through, right? But I think that could easily be part of it as well.
I just think they were arrogant. They could not see a higher power, which was working through Daniel. They wouldn't accept that. And it seems like, see, we're going through the same thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
They're not learning anything through the various kings. They're not accepting Daniel's God.
Right.
And there's almost a parallel between that and the New Testament when the religious leaders of Jerusalem wouldn't accept
Mm-hmm.
what the Father was doing through Jesus.
Right.
Then you have the Father, then you have God working through Daniel here.
Right.
You just can't. I think they get so full of themselves, they just can't believe there's a higher power.
Yeah, I think there's an arrogance and there's a level of fear that's part of it as well that's keeping them from wanting to.
Yeah, they have to give up something if they believe something's higher than them. Yeah.
Yeah, and just not willing to do that, give up their power for that. All right, let's translate this and go through here. How about anyone like to read from here just to the end? And it's two different things that happen, but we might as well just go ahead and finish it up from 25 to 31.
This is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means you've been weighed on the balance and found deficient. Perez means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave an order, and they clothed Daniel in purple, placed a gold chain around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62.
Isn't that funny? He doesn't even respond to the interpretation. I mean, he responds by here's your stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all
that you don't even want. Here you go. I know you don't want this, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. I'm not going to I'm not going to actually even ask any questions. Maybe he did, and the author didn't put in, but it doesn't seem like he cared enough, or maybe he just was so arrogant he just didn't want it. I don't know. It's hard to really tell. So we have you have the past, present, and the future with how this is kind of played out. The past, when he was appointed to God, so he set him up, but God has numbered his kingdom and put it into it. So you have the present moment of what they're evaluating, and then you have the future moment that you see here with Perez, with the Medes and the Persians coming to attack. A lot of times you'll see Medes and Persians. Many times they were different people groups, but at this point they're close enough that you'll see sometimes them being interchangeable here, because we know that some of them were Persians, some of them were Medes. Like I said, they'd kind of joined together, and then Darius here is a Mede that you'll see there at the end of this chapter. So he sees this, what's going on here, and just the mene, so that's probably a mina or a shekel and a half type amount of shekels, which shows us monetary units that are being placed on a scale. Mene sounded like mina, meaning the number, meaning God had numbered the days of the Babylonian Empire. Tekal, meaning to weigh. Belshazzar had been weighed by God's scales and had been found wanting. Upsaran sounded like the word persus, to break into, as in not that he's been split, but that he's been broken, as in his kingdom has been broken, and the Medes and the Persians are coming in. The idea that his days are numbered, that you see in 26, is mainly the fulfilling of a prophecy that his days did not have to be numbered. If Belshazzar would have turned around earlier on at some point and turned to God, his days would not have been numbered. His kingdom would not have been numbered. But what Daniel is pointing out here is that they were, because of his lack of obedience and his arrogance towards God, and his idolatry. Any other observations from those from the phrase that we see here?
This is the second time Daniel's had to interpret the same thing. Because the first one with the statue, that he didn't see the dream. The and he had to say what the dream was, and then interpret it. 4 kingdoms, right?
Right.
We talked about that.
Right.
So this is the Persian kingdom coming to fruition at the end of this.
Here it is. Yes. So the prophetic message is happening. This is a. All right, let's continue on. All right. So as we see here, he has no response there in verse 29. Does what he's going to do, even after Daniel said, "Don't worry about it. I'm not going to do it. I don't want anything that you can offer." Belshazzar, unfortunately, depending on who you ask, probably his mother, unfortunately died that evening, and most likely slain by. We don't know by who, unless you guys have something in your notes. I couldn't find anything, but it's most likely by a Persian or a Mede who just knocked down the door. And Darius comes and takes over the kingdom the very next day.
So we've gone from the gold part of the statue down to the silver part.
Yes, we've transitioned. So, last week I read to you the, I believe it was Xenophon's version of how they went down and how everything was destroyed and how the Euphrates River was backed up so they could cross and attack the Babylonians and come in there. For the most part, it's believed by many that for the most part no one was really killed that evening. Not really killed. It was pretty much a non-violent taking over of Babylon when it happened. There's this thing called the Cyrus Cylinder, which is an explanation of how it happened. And he says that Cyrus says that he entered as Babylon as a friend and set up a seat of government in the royal palace amidst celebration and jubilation. So his take on this is that everyone was really happy to see Cyrus to come in and take over the kingdom. And that his troops walked around in peace throughout Babylon. When Cyrus actually referred to Belshazzar as Marduk, of course the Babylonian god. Soon after, Nabonidus had returned, and he was handed over to Cyrus, who eventually was killed by Cyrus because he did not worship Cyrus. But for the most part, it was a relatively peaceful takeover of Babylon by the people of Cyrus, the Persian people. Now, there were several battles going on around in other cities, some that Nabonidus had fought, some that actually Belshazzar probably went and fought, and some other groups had fought as well. There's a thing called the Babylonian Chronicle, which had a little bit different take, but was similar to what Cyrus had said. And what the Babylonian Chronicle would say is that Nabonidus was actually back in Babylon during this time, and he was allowed by Cyrus to lead their New Year festival and allowed to have all their proper gods and everyone involved. While Cyrus was attacking another city that the Babylonians owned or ruled over, it was called Opis, which is over on the Tigris River. The people of Babylon revolted, and then that's when Cyrus came to keep them from revolting. One of the cities, named Sippar, was taken without any sort of fight. The governor that I mentioned earlier, the Persian governor who I mentioned earlier, Ugbaru, and the troops of Cyrus, they entered Babylon again without any sort of issues. The Babylonians then would say that Nabonidus was then arrested there that night. When he was trying to get back, and he was sent off into exile. So the Babylonians say he was not killed. And then the Babylonians also do admit that people of Babylon were happy when Cyrus arrived, and they waved palm branches, and then peace settled over the city, and Cyrus proclaimed peace on all of Babylon. So, like I said earlier, there's the Jewish version, there's the Babylonian version, and there's the Persian/Mede version of how this went on, and then there's the Greek version from a couple centuries later, which is much more of a narrative and fun kind of Iliad type story that happens. So just like I was talking about earlier, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Darius and those guys in chapter 6. There's so many different viewpoints of what happened and how Babylon fell to Persia. And it's one of those things where you can find good historical scholars who will provide you really good insight and historical evidence about all these have some sort of truth to them. Again, just like when I was talking about the battle that my dad fought in, his take was different than another historian's take, and then different from what we're starting to see now that's starting to become unclassified. So it's just very, very different about different takes. And if you look about it, this Greek historian writing 200 years later was a little bit different. He actually probably added a little more detail to it to make it more of an interesting story. So, which happens in history. Any thoughts on chapter 5 before we move into 6? A few minutes.
Just that Daniel survived all this.
Right, and he's still going.
You take with Nebuchadnezzar, first of all, when he was in the fiery furnace. And here he gives a negative report to Belshazzar, who was killing everybody in sight.
Right.
Now, why would he not, if it wasn't in God's plan, why would he have not said to Daniel, you're dead, you gave me a negative report, I'm going to be out of business here in a short while.
Yeah.
You know,
He had nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Instead, he gives him the purple robe and a necklace.
Instead of chopping his head off, he gave him a necklace. I can't quite figure that yet.
I don't know. Yeah, it's odd that the way this guy responds to this. Any other thoughts? All right, let's get going on chapter 6. We have go for about another 13 minutes. So now we have Daniel continues to now he's under Persian rule. He is with Darius. We'll talk a little bit about who Darius is here in a second, but this is about the same time period when Zechariah has gone back to Judah. After asking Darius to go back and rebuild the temple. So we're about in that time period. So Daniel has remained there where he has been, and then now Zechariah and many others have gone back. So we're in a post-exile time period here. And we'll know that many remained in Medo-Persia, while many went back to Judah and Jerusalem to rebuild. We know again, and we'll continue to see through chapter 6 here, that Daniel, though he is with a powerful king and that he serves a very powerful king, the Persian king, he ultimately will still continue to hold his allegiance to God, no matter how hard it gets for him or whatever comes his way. His ultimate commitment is there to God. This is actually chapter 6 is the last account of Daniel's life. After this, it's going to start going into more prophecy and visions, and actually, mainly visions. And so this is going to be really the last history that we get of Daniel here in chapter 6. And so I just wanted to give you that little heads up before we get going on. As I said earlier, if we see where we are here. Yeah, so we're at 539, so Belshazzar is now gone. 539, Darius takes over. We're now in that time period. So just kind of give you, let's talk a little bit about Darius, or Darius, depending on who you're talking to. There are actually 3 different Persian kings named Darius. There's one we know of in Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. And there's another Darius in the book of Daniel who is more of a Mede than a Persian. So it may not be the same. This is where it gets kind of funny or interesting. It's hard to tell who this Darius is that is being referred to here, and it may not even been Darius. It could have been Cyrus, who is. It could have. Some people say it could have been him. It could have also been the guy, another guy named Gubaru, who is not Ugabaru, who we talked about earlier. So we have Gubaru, who is a governor, and then you had, I'm sorry, no, Gubru was the governor. No, sorry. You have two guys. You have
Peterborough was the general.
Ugbaru is the general and Gubru is the governor. Sorry, thank you. Yeah. But it's not the same. Yeah, so anyways. So there's, as you can imagine, their names kind of close, so sometimes we get them confused. He's not that general that we saw earlier on. And so Gubru was appointed governor of Babylon by Cyrus in 539. And then he appointed governors underneath him, which is what we're seeing there in the early few verses of chapter 6. General Ugbaru died in 539, and we're not sure how or why he did, but he did die. We know from the context here that, of course, just because it tells us that Darius was 62 years old. We also know that he's the son of Ahasuerus, who was a Mede, if we were to go to chapter 9, verse 1, I believe. Yes. And so you see that there. So there's, I probably looked at 4 or 5 different variations of who this guy is, and I know that you guys are just dying to know. And so I'm going to give you 2 more variations of it, and we'll go from there. I don't know if I want to. Let's see here. Okay, yeah. So it could be. So you have half the group who say is most likely this Darius guy is Cyrus II, a subordinate of Cyrus, of course, the first, or the crown prince Cambyses. But then there's a disagreement about being Cyrus too, because he was mentioned as a separate person later on here in this very chapter in 628. Cambyses could have been, Prince Cambyses could have been 62 years old at this point, but he did not actually become king of the empire until 529. So his first year could not precede Cyrus's third year, 536. And then there's even some more complication here, is that Cyrus and Cambyses could not be Medes because they were not related to Ahasuerus. They could have had Median mothers, which could have made them Medes, but if their father was Persian, they would have, of course, been referred to as Persians. And they, of course, consider themselves Persians and not Medes. Is that crystal clear now? Yeah.
I'll give you a 5th one then.
Okay, go ahead.
The 5th one is an acronym for, like, vice president, senator, because you get all these Dariuses in here.
Yes.
You will see they are appointed people.
They are.
And that may well be a suggestion that they were vice president, senator,
yes,
whatever, and that was
right.
That's how they were addressed.
In other words, it's a title.
It's
a title.
A title.
Yep, very well could be. That's if you want to simplify it.
Yeah.
No, which is very true. I've seen what you're saying. That viewpoint as well. But it's who is it though? I think is what people are trying to decipher.
We can't figure it out.
You really can't figure it out at the end of the day because there's just so much to it. But let's stop at this point on that part. Unless you want to talk more about it, but I don't. Let's do 1 through 5, and then we'll probably wrap it up after 1 through 5. If someone wants to read those.
Alright, I'll go. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the other administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps therefore kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God.
All right. So what have they figured out? So it's the same cast of characters, it seems like, right? The same sort of, we're just, it's on repeat one more time. This time there's not a dream or an interpretation or a vision that needs to get figured out, but there's these, and this is where I think a lot of the anti-Semitism part comes out through this because of how they're treating him or how they're looking to him. Where do you guys, what else are you guys seeing here that they're doing with Daniel, or how he's being set up?
Well, I mean, also they're feeling threatened. I mean, they found out that the king had planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom, and so they're probably very jealous.
They're jealous.
It just sounds like
Yeah.
Definite envy there. They
Little bit of envy?
want
Yeah.
power.
They would want.
Yeah, so let's say it's
Why
like,
not me?
could be prime minister, or something similar to a prime minister.
And they would want the power to exploit it.
Right?
And yet they're finding fault in him according to, just to get rid of it. They're just trapping him.
Right.
They're clearly crooked. They're just crooked. They're playing a political game to gain power. They're willing to lie in order to get it. They don't have ethics, but it's so interesting how they use the ethical standard against Daniel.
Right.
They hold up this ethical standard as if it's something important,
Yeah.
and say Daniel has broken the standard, and yet they themselves live without the standard.
Right. And what is it they're ultimately going to try to get him on? What's his weak point that
The
he's
law of his God.
his own God, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a God they certainly don't believe in, obviously. So we're gonna see that. And why do you think that was? Because if you go back up to 3, we come back to Daniel distinguishing himself again. They know that he's of an extraordinary, or he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And then, of course, they're pointing most likely to like a prime minister position.
I'm curious how
Yeah.
verse 3 is worded in some other translations.
Sure.
NIV says his exceptional qualities. Noted his exceptional qualities. The version you read said, how did it say? Exceptional spirit?
extraordinary spirit.
Extraordinary spirit. Yeah. I would say that is probably your closest. Yeah, extraordinary spirit. I would say that's probably your closest interpretation to that, because it's the author is trying to point out that there is something, supernatural within him, that he has the ability to do this. It's not just his own physical, personal abilities. And the people have figured that out. Now they don't. They just think of this law of his God. Of course, they thought he was, back then they thought if you're a monotheist, you were also, you're for the most part an atheist, because if you only have one God, that makes no sense. You should have many gods to cover all your bases. So he was odd in that case as well. And we see that later on in the New Testament too. Paul and other people deal with that. But so he's just a kind of an odd duck in a really corrupt world, to be a person of ethics, to be someone who will always walk on the higher ground, or be on the high ground. They don't like that, and they certainly don't want to take the high ground to get their own promotion or their own better way of living. They want to be able to take other people down. And fortunately, we've all learned from this, and no one does that anymore, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. But,
in our evolved society.
yeah, we've evolved significantly as humans since then.
Looks like what John said earlier, there was some anti-Semitism involved.
Absolutely.
He, like John also pointed out, by this time he's very, very old.
Mm-hmm.
Probably some of those rulers were younger, so he's old school. And, the guy, we don't want any part of it.
So we don't want to deal with the old guy anymore. It's kind of, I would think absolutely Belshazzar was there. But yeah, I think this guy's just some old quack who's been here for a while. Let's just send him on. Yeah. because he doesn't need to have all the power. Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. Any other observations of these first 5 verses? I've always been curious in verse 2. So we know one was Daniel, so they have one Jewish commissioner. I wonder if the others were Medes or Persians or Babylonians, or who the other commissioners were. I just thought that's just interesting. They don't tell us, but it'd be curious to see who he was up there with. And it probably wasn't just Persians and Medes who were trying to accuse him there in verse 4. They're probably from many different backgrounds and nationalities who had formed together as these empires were being built. Anything else you guys see in there? What about just one last thing, and then we'll take off. Think about the tension that he had to live in. For them to know that, there in verse 5, that the only way we can get this guy is if we do something that's related to his religion and his God. Think about the tension and the constant issues that Daniel had to deal with, and then you think of all the other Jewish people who were in exile and who are trying to hold true to their Jewish faith. Just think about what a world like that would be like, to be constantly watched, oppressed, to have that just constant tension of if I'm too Jewish, I could lose my job. If I'm too Jewish, I could lose my way of life, my family. Someone's going to try to kill me. So to live in that sort of tension constantly, you either were extremely devout, or I think we've talked about this a couple times already, or you've fallen away, right? You're like, well, I'll just be Jewish either culturally, or you know what, I like all these other gods too. I'm just going to join this group altogether. But you just think how devout they would have to be to get to this point, to where even Daniel, that's the only thing they have on him, is that he is a monotheistic believer in the Jewish God. So. But one thing we've seen over and over and over again that their gods cannot do, that we're going to see here again, is that God is sovereign. God is sovereign over these people who are trying to kill Daniel, over all the world. We're also going to see that he's the one who's going to redeem, and he's the one who's going to save. He's a great Savior. And so something that they've forgotten, and that we're going to see as we go through the rest of this chapter. And it's one of those things that I think we can think of as well in our current context. Us not being Jewish, but being followers of Christ is I don't think anyone in here, someone's trying to kill you or take you out right now because of your faith. I know we have Christian brothers and sisters in other parts of the world that's happening to on a regular basis. But just think, they have to live in a similar sort of constant tension in that regard. One thing, I'm going to go a little bit of administrative here of what we have to deal with here at the church. And it's something that is unfortunate, but we, as you guys know, we have missionaries in Central Asia, and sometimes the government's very friendly to our missionaries over there, and sometimes the governments over there are not very friendly to them. And we're dealing with an issue now where the government has shut off a lot of their bank accounts because they don't want them. What they're doing is they're interpreting the Bible into a couple new languages. And so they've cut off their bank accounts where they can only deal in cash. And so we've been asked as a church to send them cash. Well, legally we cannot send them cash because we have to be able to track where that money goes. And so it's one of these sort of fine lines that we have to track, is how do we stay legal within our own government but help our missionaries who are in Central Asia trying to spread the gospel, keep them funded and hopefully out of trouble and from getting kicked out of the country or something even worse. And so I bring that up is because there's a tension that you may not think we're facing, but when you're that deep in it, like our friends are over there in Central Asia, they're dealing with a lot of the stuff that Daniel's dealing with. People are trying to figure out ways how we're going to get these bad guys out of here because we don't agree with their monotheistic beliefs, and we want them to go on. And we want to figure out either to throw them in the lion's den or just to kick them out of the country. And here, we kind of behind the scenes of what we're trying to work through a lot of times is how do we support them? How do we keep them safe? And how do we continue to allow them to do their work over there? And so we have that tension here. Fortunately, fortunately, according to my wife, our lives aren't in danger here, but they are in danger over in Central Asia. And I just see some similarities here with what Daniel's dealing with, and that tension.
Pardon me, can you identify Central Asia? What country you're talking
Yeah, Turkey.
China, Turkey?
Yeah. Mainly Turkey and Syria and
Yeah.
that area, where a lot of the fun stuff's going on right now.
Well, Erdogan, he wants to go Muslim.
Yeah.
He's Hamas all the way. So
Yeah.
he's purging everything out of that country.
Yeah.
So how do you get money into there?
That's what we're dealing with.
When did the bank account issue begin? Is this pretty recent?